Hi, I'm Lisa Berry Drago.
And I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And this is Distillations. This spring, we debuted the first season of Disappearing Spoon, a podcast collaboration with New York Times bestselling author Sam Kean. And now it's back for season 2, with stories of murder at Harvard University, animals being put on trial, and how a simple surgery produced some of the greatest singers in the world. The first episode of the new season will drop on Tuesday, October 5th.
To celebrate the new season, our producer, Rigoberto Hernandez, sat down with Sam Kean to talk about his new book, Icepick Surgeon, Murder, Fraud, Sabotage Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. This interview is a great companion piece for the upcoming season. Many of the stories in the book relate directly to the upcoming season of Disappearing Spoon.
In our interview with Sam, he talks about some of the case studies in his book, including how Thomas Edison shifted his ethics on the death penalty because of a grudge, how a part-time chemist from Philadelphia became an unlikely spy, and how an American doctor purposefully infected people in Guatemala with venereal diseases, all in the name of science. And now, the interview.
I want to start by talking about the image of the mad scientist. This is an image that I think about in popular culture as kind of a deranged person who is obsessed and consumed with their work, and they'll do anything to reach these goals. Can you tell me what are the characteristics of a mad scientist, and what does that have to do with your new book?
I think that is a common trope in popular culture, this idea of a mad scientist, someone who's deranged and kind of has lost all their reasoning. But in the book, I think actually, and in real life in general, I think it's more common actually for a mad scientist to be someone who actually reasons too well. In fact, they rely on their reason only, and that's all that matters to them. And it comes out in the book, I think, when you see people who get so obsessed with some topic or idea that they just take the science way too far, and they lose track of things like ethics, humanity, other people's suffering. And so the book basically examines cases where scientists did take things too far and started trampling ethical boundaries and even committing crimes in the name of science. And in most of these cases, I think it's people who actually are in some ways doing science too well, where science is all that they care about. So I think that there's maybe some truth to the popular culture myth, but you wouldn't see these people as really deranged. You would see them as deficient in other ways.
Right. And I think it's best if we just kind of jump into some of these examples. And I'm going to start out with talking about a man named Henry Smithman, who was an English naturalist in the 18th century. And, this is a time of great discoveries throughout Africa, but he couldn't really finance his own expeditions, and the British government didn't always finance them either. So how did he afford his travels, and what does it say about science' uncomfortable relationship with slavery?
Basically, as you said, Henry Smithman could not finance his own travels. He was too poor. He didn't have the means to do it himself. And this was a time when the government really didn't sponsor scientific expeditions, and in fact didn't really sponsor scientific research, period. There were some occasions where they did a little bit, but not nearly the extent that they would later. It was just an era where science was not government funded. But Smithman was afire with natural history. He wanted to be a scientist very badly. And the only way he could get to places where he wanted to study insects, he was an entomologist, the only way he could get to these places was by taking advantage of the infrastructure of slavery. Because the people who were going to places like Africa, and later he ended up in the Caribbean, the only people going to these places were slavers. And this was unfortunate for him because he was an abolitionist. He opposed slavery. But he decided that he would compromise his morals a little bit, and he would go down to Africa on a ship that he knew would later be taking slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. And he told himself this was just a small compromise. He wasn't really participating in the slave trade. He was just doing this one little thing. But, sort of foreshadowing, it turned out to be not so easy once he got down there. because the entire economy, basically, of the colony that he went to was built around slavery. There was no way to avoid being involved in slavery. And as hard as he tried to avoid it, he simply could not if he wanted to get his work done. And it's not like he had zero options. He could have not done the science. He could have come back to England somehow. But he decided that the science was the important part. And basically, step by small step, you see him compromising his morals. You see him making bad decision after bad decision, and eventually getting involved in the slave trade himself. It started off maybe just trading for supplies with slavers, and then it got a little worse and a little worse. And eventually he's actually owning people himself and sending them to plantations in the Americas as sort of a form of currency in order to make money to finance his science. And it's really hard to think about him because he wasn't a victim. The victims were the people who were being enslaved. But I think it is a good example of essentially how important slavery was to the economy at that time, and also how easily someone, when they got obsessed, could compromise their own morals and kind of go off the rails the way he did.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about his motivation in this case. And he wanted to be part of the elite people in England who are part of the Royal Society. And that kind of is what drove him.
Yeah, he had a real desire to be a famous scientist. As you said, he wanted to be in the Royal Society. He wanted to come back and publish these well-received books. He wanted to be a famous scientist. And part of it was that, England had a pretty rigid class system, especially at the time. And science was one way that someone who was fairly low-born could rise up the ranks and become a respectable gentleman. And he had his eye on that and always wanted to be a respectable gentleman, I should say, in addition to his burning desire to learn about the natural world. So you had kind of these dual motivations going on with him.
Yeah, and he wasn't the only one. There were other names that you mentioned in your book. There was Carl Linnaeus. There was Isaac Newton. He didn't participate in the slave trade directly, but the fact is that there was a really famous observatory in Southern Hemisphere that was in Cape Town that was built on slave labor. And Hans Sloane, too, they also reaped the benefits of slavery. Can you talk a little bit about how science... Oh, this is not something that is talked about. You don't think about synonymous slave trade with science, but in fact, some of the seminal pieces of work of the time are built kind of on slave labor.
Yeah, this is something that historians have been talking about with slavery kind of in general over the years. More lately, that if you look at the economy of places like England, then the United States, it really was built on slave labor. So it's kind of impossible in some ways to talk about the economy and the government in general without talking about all the benefits they reaped from slavery. And very recently, some historians have decided to expand that and talk about science and in terms of what science has benefited from slavery as well. So you mentioned Hans Sloane, who was a plantation owner in Jamaica, became very, very wealthy. And he was a collector. So he collected specimens, plants, animals from around the world, and eventually amassed the single largest collection of specimens in the world at the time. And when Hans Sloane died, he did something which was kind of unusual in that he willed his giant collection to the British government, provided that they set up some sort of institution where scholars could come, the public could come, basically people, general people, could benefit from his collection. And actually, that collection ended up becoming the core collection of the British Museum. So one of the world's most famous cultural institutes was built essentially on a fortune that came from slave labor in Jamaica. And obviously, that's something they don't like to advertise or talk about, but that is simply the reality, is that this museum, its core foundation, would not exist without the slave labor that was going on in the Americas. So that's kind of a direct benefit of slavery. And then you mentioned someone like Isaac Newton, who was not really working in the slave trade or dabbling in it himself, but ended up indirectly benefiting from it in the following way. So Newton was very interested at the time in gravity. And one thing he wanted to study with gravity is tides, because the gravitational tug of the moon is what causes tides around the world. And Newton had certain theories about how gravity worked. So he was looking for evidence of how the tides changed and how they varied at different points around the world based on where the moon was at the time. And Newton needed data, therefore, from around the world in different places. But the only people that he could be in touch with, that he had contact with in these different places around the world, were people working at slave ports. So Newton ended up writing letters to them and gathering data about the tides from people at slave ports around the world. And that became a key piece of evidence that he used in setting up his monumental theory of gravity. So without the slave trade, even something like Newton's celestial mechanics might not have come across. That sort of shows how pervasive slavery was at the time.
In the end, Smithman ended up not getting what he wanted, which was being part of the Royal Society. And also, when he was coming back to England, I believe it was a pirate ship, they basically emptied out his collection of stuff that he was bringing over to England.
Yeah, so Smithman basically ended up with some bad luck on the way back in that a pirate ship intercepted his ship, and they basically threw all his specimens overboard. So all of the specimens he'd spent all this time collecting did not actually make it back to England with him. And he'd actually expected he would get sort of a hero's welcome when he got back, because he had done some really interesting and innovative work on termites and termite mounds. But because of his background, because of the poor family that he came from, the Royal Society sort of snubbed him. The leader of the society at the time was a very patrician person, and he looked down on people like Smithman. So despite all his compromises, Smithman never got the specimens back to England and never ended up getting what he wanted in the end. So in a way, all his dabbling in the slave trade ended up doing no good for him personally either.
It's curious that people like Smithman eventually did speak out against slavery. And this kind of complicates his character in that he wasn't, you can't say he was a monster, but he didn't change from ethical scientist to monster to ethical science overnight. These things don't happen overnight, and they're not clear cut.
Yeah, it did take him a while. He didn't go down there and instantly start doing bad, and then he didn't reform himself instantly and kind of pull away from that. Basically, while he was in Africa and he was doing his science, he was hiring local people who, as scouts and helpers, things like that. And these were not slaves. These were free people who just happened to be locals. And he was using them as scouts and guides to help do his, he did some kind of pioneering work on termites and termite mounds. And as long as he was in Africa, he could kind of keep it at one remove. Eventually, he ended up traveling along the triangular trade. So instead of going straight back to England, he had to go over to the Caribbean first because most ships were going that direction. And when he got to the Caribbean, he wanted to sail from there back to England. But he had bad timing. It was the Revolutionary War, and suddenly he was stuck in the Caribbean. He could not leave it because of all the future United States ships that were patrolling and preventing ships from going to England. So he ends up there, kind of stuck there, and he decides to do some natural history work there. But in the course of that, he comes across slave plantations, and he realizes just how bad things are there. And once he's confronted with it, he immediately recoils, he repents, he decides he can't have anything to do with slavery again. So as you said, he's not a monster, but he did end up doing real harm to people. And that is something that I think comes up with a lot of stories in the book, is that these people aren't monsters and that, with a few exceptions, they did not set out to do bad at the beginning. They were not sadistic people. But you watch them make bad decisions, compromise their morals, fall prey to tunnel vision, just make these mistakes and do bad things and harm in the end.
I want to move on to another case study. And I think the best way to start this is by talking about a Scottish nursery rhyme that goes something like this: Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy who buys the beef. It sounds really catchy. Can you explain who are these people in this rhyme and why it's more ominous than it sounds?
Yeah, it's kind of like the ring around the posy, which actually means the Black Plague and stuff like that. It sounds nice as kids, but it's ominous. So the people mentioned there were Burke and Hare and Knox. And Burke and Hare were two regular individuals. They kind of jointly ran a boarding house, an inn where people would stay over. And Robert Knox was an anatomist, so he studied the human body. And Robert Knox was working in Edinburgh in the early 1800s, and like all anatomists at the time, he faced a problem, which was that people back then simply did not donate their bodies to science. So if he wanted to dissect a body, he essentially had to steal it. He had to rob a grave to get a body and dissect it. And as you can imagine, a lot of people were not happy about having their loved ones' bodies robbed and dissected. They didn't want that to happen to their loved ones, and their loved ones had not wanted that to happen to them in their lives. There were a lot of societal taboos against dissecting people at the time. So Knox, as an anatomist, was kind of wrapped up in this dirty business of robbing graves. In the book, I talk about all of the different things that caused, the riots that caused around the world, all the scuzzy people that anatomists had to associate with that were robbing graves, stuff like that. But the Burke and Hare case actually turned out to be even darker than just robbing graves. So with Burke and Hare, it started off, I wouldn't say innocently, but not that malevolently, in that in the boarding house they were running, an old man died one day. He was sick, he was ill, he passed away while he was staying there, and they called the church authorities in to come and get the body and to bury it. But right after they had summoned the church authorities, one of them thought, I wish I hadn't done this. I wish what I had actually done was sold the body, because I know that there are anatomists around who pay good money for bodies. And then the other one came in and said, well, that would actually have been a good idea, and maybe it's not too late. Maybe we could actually swap the bodies out. So they pulled a bit of a switcheroo there, and they actually swapped in some debris and refuse into the coffin that they were going to use and had the church haul away just rubble, essentially, and bury that. Meanwhile, they snuck the body out the back door, got it to Robert Knox, and sold it for some good money. In fact, more money than they probably would have made in several months of running the tavern and boarding house. So it was very good money for them. And after this, they started thinking about it a little too much and thinking, that was such easy money. That was such good money. Is there a way we could get some more of it? So instead of just letting people die at their boarding house, what they ended up doing is actually killing people who were working at their boarding house. And at first, it started with someone who was already quite sick again, and they decided to just help him along a little bit. They plugged his nose, covered his mouth, and they ended up killing him a few days before he probably would have died. Sold the body again, got a little good money, then they got a little bolder. And after this, they came up with a sort of method that they would use, which is they would get their victims extremely drunk. They usually targeted alcoholics or other people who had a lot of troubles like that. They would get them extremely drunk. The person would pass out, and then they would suffocate them. One of them would smother their face with a pillow, while the other one sat on their chest in order to stop them from breathing. And I think they kind of stumbled into this, but it turned out to be a very effective way to kill people because forensically, it was very hard to prove that they had suffocated as opposed to just, dying of alcohol overdose or something like that. So they ended up killing something like a dozen or 14 people and selling them all to this anatomist, Robert Knox. So that's where the buying the beef, the bodies of the nursery rhyme comes in, because Burke and Hare were killing people and selling the beef to the anatomist, Robert Knox.
Yeah. What's so fascinating about Robert Knox is that he was willing to look the other way in order to get the bodies. I think that speaks to like this don't ask, don't tell kind of mentality that he had, which is surprising to hear from a scientist.
Yeah, I think that don't ask, don't tell is the exact right way to put it, in that they just turned a blind eye. They did not want to know where the bodies came from. And they knew the people that were robbing graves. They were usually, kind of thugs. They had a criminal record of some sort. And Knox knew that Burke and Hare weren't necessarily those kind of people who were doing that, but he just didn't want to know where the bodies came from. As long as they came in, and as long as he didn't ask too many questions, he felt that he had some plausible deniability. And for him, it was just easy bodies. It was an easy way to get his science done. And, what you said is interesting there, that it's not something we normally think about scientists doing, because I think in our society, we do have a general rosy view of science. We think about scientists as people who are doing work that's going to benefit the public. They have the public good in mind, and that they're people, they're doing work that's going to benefit everyone around us and benefit society at large. But in the book, you do run across these cases where the science actually kind of overrides their desire to help out society or help out people in general, and the science actually ends up harming society. So it's interesting that you said that, because I do think that is kind of a baseline, unexamined assumption that we have, that science is for the greater good. I think it's justified in most cases. Science usually is for the greater good. But every once in a while, you do have people kind of crossing into that dark side.
And you mentioned that it led people to do kind of bad decisions, and even famous people. One of them was actually Thomas Edison, who is kind of like this folk hero of science that you learn in fifth grade or third grade. And they talk about how he had no education, but he went on to invent amazing things like the phonograph and electricity as we know it, and all these great things that he did. But he was, as you put it in your book, and let me check my notes here, he could be a real bastard. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so Edison is kind of this American scientific folk hero. Every school child learns about Thomas Edison and all of the great inventions that he did. And, I think that there's been kind of a counter-narrative against that, where they talk about the fact that Edison was kind of running more of a workshop and didn't give his workers a lot of credit, things like that. But I think any way you slice it, he was a pretty amazing inventor. The phonograph is an amazing invention. And even something like the light bulb, he doesn't deserve all of the credit for it, but he made the light bulb the common and safe instrument that revolutionized America. It really was a pretty amazing thing. In the book, though, I talk about how Edison's desire to be famous and desire essentially to win credit for himself ended up compromising his morals in a lot of different ways in his fight with his rivals, so Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, who ran the Westinghouse Electricity Company. Essentially, Westinghouse and Tesla were heavily invested in alternating current, or AC. Edison, meanwhile, was very heavily invested in direct current, or DC. And Edison was basically willing to do whatever it took to discredit AC and to win recognition and glory for his own DC, direct current. And there's a quote from a businessman, one of Edison's first business partners, who said that Thomas Edison has a vacuum where his conscience ought to be. And I think that really comes out in this case of his rivalry with AC, because he was willing to do whatever it took to discredit AC. To the point where, and I know this is kind of hard for some people to hear or to read about, but he would actually take animals, dogs and horses, put them on stage and electrocute them with alternating current in order to show, supposedly, that alternating current was much more dangerous than direct current. So he was willing to torture and sacrifice dogs, horses, cows, other animals, just in order to discredit his scientific rivals. And this led to something even worse, which was that early in his life, Edison was a pretty committed opponent of the death penalty. He just said, I do not like the death penalty. I think it snuffs people out when maybe there's a chance for redemption in them. He was an opponent of the death penalty. Someone eventually came to him and said, well, it's kind of barbarous to hang people or to shoot them. Maybe we could use electricity to try to kill people in a more gentle way. And Edison said no, he was not going to support this. He was an opponent of the death penalty. But then he got thinking about it a little bit more, and he realized that, wait a second, if someone was actually going to use alternating current to kill someone, that could actually be a good thing because, again, it would further discredit alternating current. So Edison got behind what became known as the electric chair. He threw over his earlier opposition to the death penalty completely and sent one of his lackeys out, essentially, to build the first electric chair. And that's where the electric chair came from, was Thomas Edison's rivalry with George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla.
Well, first of all, by the way, like that chapter was horrific because it involved dogs. And as a dog lover, that was just horrible. But you write in your book that it might be tempting to excuse Edison by saying that he was a product of his time. But why is that problematic?
I do think there is a trap that we can fall into in modern times, which is looking back at people in history and applying our own moral standards and moral judgments to them, when the truth is we would have probably had those same opinions had we been born at that time. It's just a matter of everyone believed certain things at that time. No one questioned them at that time. So I think it is unfair in some cases to condemn people for believing certain things that we just don't uphold and we don't believe today. It's sort of a revisionist judgment on them in history. However, that said, I do think there are cases where we can judge people in history if there was opposition at the time. And with Edison, in this case, there were a lot of people who stopped and said, wait a second, this is horrible. You are torturing these animals. You are killing them. And I don't think it was an era when animals were treated all that well generally, but people were not putting up with Edison doing this. There were newspaper articles condemning him. People stood up at the lectures and the demonstrations, and they condemned the people on stage. There was a fierce opposition to this kind of work even at the time, but Edison ignored it. His rivalry and besting his rivals was what mattered to him, and he was willing to overlook these criticisms and just plow ahead, essentially.
Yeah. And this gets us to like a big conversation about the use of animals in scientific studies. And, Distillations did a story about Alzheimer's, and reading so much of the literature for the past 30 years in Alzheimer's, a lot of the work was done with mice. And it turns out that up until like a couple years ago, there wasn't a drug that's been developed that actually worked. And people were actually blaming this reliance on mice who are not like us, but some of the stuff that works on them doesn't work on humans. What are some of the problems or issues with animal testing?
I mean, it's almost a cliche at this point where, in fact, I think there's a Twitter account that it just appends the words works in mice or works only in mice or something to studies that come out and kind of overpromise that a new drug or a new treatment is going to stop Alzheimer's or stop Parkinson's or cure cancer or something like that. It is a good reminder that, hey, mice are very different organisms than us. We diverged from them, I think it was something like 70 million years ago. So back when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth, that's when the line that became rodents and the line that eventually became human beings, that's when it split. So there's a lot of different biology going on there. So that's not to say animal studies are useless. And in fact, you can look in the past at things that we've learned from animal studies. But I think there's a sense that there might be sort of diminishing returns nowadays, and that essentially what worked in the past won't necessarily work in the future. There's an old cliche about generals that they're always fighting the last war. So they're using the tactics that worked before and just assuming that the same things are going to work in the future. And I think there is a bit of a danger with that in science, that just because it worked in the past doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work in the future. To use another metaphor, sort of the low-hanging fruit might have already been plucked. And to make progress in the future, we might need to look at different methods. And I doubt if animal testing will go away, period. But I don't think it's going to play as big of a role. I think people are starting to get a little more uncomfortable with just the sheer scale, the hundreds of millions of animals that die every single year. And I also think that people are starting to realize, again, that there's diminishing returns and that just because it works in animals, especially with complicated diseases like Alzheimer's, it might not work in humans. So we might need to be looking for different alternatives.
Right. And going from experimentation with animals into experimentation with humans, I think that no one is more horrific in this arena than the Nazis were. And the Nazis always play a convenient villain for the United States. And as you point out in your book, it's easier for US doctors to say, we're not as bad as the Nazis, therefore we must be okay. Can you tell us about some of the Nazi atrocities and what's the problem with this kind of thinking of like the Nazis are the clear evil and anything below that is fine?
Yeah, so the Nazis and the work that they did on concentration camp prisoners in World War II, they are a bit of an exception in the book in that what they were doing was very clearly sadistic and wrong and had very little scientific value from the very get-go. So there was no sense where they, started off with good intentions and then just went a little off the path. They were bad from the very beginning, doing horrific stuff the entire time. And unfortunately, that, as you said, sort of skewed the view of what was acceptable and not acceptable in science because it set the bar so very low. And essentially after that, anything that wasn't as bad as the Nazi science, it wasn't that it was considered good, but it wasn't considered to be as big of a deal. And I think even a bigger issue was that we could look at the scientists who were doing that work in Nazi Germany and say, well, that happened over there. There are people over there in this horrific fascist regime doing terrible things, but we live in a democracy. We're free. We can govern ourselves. We have morals. And so I don't think there was a sense where you really needed to have much oversight over scientists and really watch what they were doing as much. And this was an era as well, around World War II, when money was suddenly flooding into science. And you had a lot more people joining the ranks of scientists and becoming scientists. So there was a lot of money, a lot of work was being done. And as usually happens, the ethics and the oversight structures lagged behind. So you had a lot of people kind of running around doing what they wanted with very little oversight. And again, it was this sense that just because they're not doing things as bad as the Nazis, well, it's okay, or we can kind of overlook it. But as I talk about in the book, there were, ironically, right when they were forming the Nuremberg Code, which governs ethical research on human subjects, there were some really horrific studies going on in the United States. There was the Tuskegee syphilis study, and there was another study, it wasn't, I guess, in the United States, but run by United States doctors, where they were going down to Guatemala and actually giving people STDs like syphilis and gonorrhea without telling them that they were doing this. So they were infecting them and in some cases killing them without telling them that they were giving them these awful diseases. And there just wasn't much oversight or consideration that these might be bad things to do because they weren't as bad as what the Nazis had done.
Yeah, and I'm going to break down a couple of things you mentioned there. First, after World War II is over, famously the Nuremberg trials brought Nazis and Nazi doctors to trial, and out of this comes out the Nuremberg Code. What makes the Nuremberg Code different than, say, the Hippocratic Oath?
The Hippocratic Oath is really focused on doctors and what doctors are doing. The most famous part is do no harm, or first do no harm. So don't do anything that's going to harm the patient. And that's great. That's a good sort of moral precept to keep in mind. Unfortunately, that sort of presumes that the doctors will be able to govern themselves, which isn't always the case, especially if you have some sort of like fascist or autocratic government that is willing to sort of distort people's morals. And the other thing I think that's problematic with it is doctors can define that in different ways. So you see people saying, well, we're talking about harm to society. So you might be able to harm a few individuals in the short term, but if we're talking about doing no harm to society or helping society out, well, that's justified to harm these individuals in the short term. So it's kind of the you gotta crack a few eggs school of science. So that can lead to people being callous or people doing bad things to individuals. And the other thing about the Hippocratic Oath is that it doesn't really take into account the patient's point of view and what's good for individual patients. And that's why Nuremberg was different, because it focused not on what the doctors should be doing, but on the rights of the individual patients in these studies. And that's where you get these notions about patients need to volunteer for the study. They need to give full and informed consent to it. The study even needs to be designed properly, because if you're going to ask people to suffer for the sake of science, if you don't have a properly designed study that can actually answer the questions that you are asking, then that's unethical of you to make people suffer when you're not actually going to get a good scientific answer out of the research. So it covers all of these things from the patient's point of view, which is different from the doctor-centric view of the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah, and I just wanted to define that because it comes up over and over again in your book about how like some of the people featured in this book really were violating the Nuremberg Code. And I want to talk about John Cutler. And, up until his death in 2003, he was sort of revered for doing work in Haiti and India to provide healthcare for women. He arranged fellowships for gynecologists. And he was one of the people who kind of condemned this moral panic around AIDS. And he didn't want to demonize victims for being gay in the 1980s. What did he do in Guatemala that kind of muddies his good deeds?
So John Cutler, if you had just looked at his obituary from around 2003, if you had just read that, he comes off like he's the second coming of Albert Schweitzer. I mean, he just seems like such a good, caring individual. He was arranging fellowships so that doctors in developing countries could come over and learn how to help women give birth safely, to prevent women from dying in childbirth. He would also go over to these countries and train doctors over there to help people in poor and rural areas so they didn't die of basic diseases. Then in the 1980s, when there was a lot of moral panic around the HIV virus and AIDS, he refused to demonize the victims. He refused to blame them for being gay. He comes across in a lot of ways as a really good moral person, and he was revered in many ways when he died. Unfortunately, a few years after he died, a historian was poking around in some archives when she came across some work that revealed that Cutler early in his career had not been so moral and in fact had done some fairly horrific things. During World War II, Cutler was involved in a project to try to eliminate STDs in the U.S. military. Essentially, there were a lot of soldiers coming down with STDs. They would have to take time off, and the military wanted to eliminate that problem. So they were trying to develop treatments to cure sexually transmitted diseases. Cutler was working on this. It didn't work out so well during the war, but after the war, he wanted to keep going with this research. Ended up meeting someone who worked down in Guatemala, and this Guatemalan recruited him to come down there and to study treatments for STDs in Guatemala, which all sounds okay on the face of it, except Cutler kind of went off the rails and started doing work where he would essentially infect people with STDs without telling them that he was going to give them these STDs. He was working with prisoners, he was working with soldiers, people who were already vulnerable and in some cases couldn't really consent to this work. And then on top of that, he was doing it in secret and luring them into the clinic. He would promise them free treatments for some disease or a health checkup or something like that. And while they were there, he would give them these diseases. So it's really, really awful things that he was doing to people. And in some cases, it even escalated where he went to patients in a psychiatric institute and started injecting gonorrhea into their arms and syphilis into their eyes and rectum, things like that. And he actually ended up killing a few people doing this work. And in my mind, it's just staggering to try to think about the two John Cutlers as the same person. And I don't really know if there's a good way to reconcile them. I don't know if Cutler, toward the end of his life, would have thought himself justified because he was trying to get rid of these diseases. And, if a few people suffer in the meantime, well, that's society at large will benefit, so it doesn't matter. Or I don't know if maybe he was repenting later in life and tried to do good in order to make up for all the harm he'd done when he was younger. It's really hard to understand what was going on in this case.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that really disturbed me about Cutler was the fact that when he was working with American servicemen, he felt duty-bound to tell them, I'm giving you a venereal disease. Versus when he was in Guatemala, he didn't felt the need to do that. And that tells me the whole story. That tells me that he dehumanized Guatemalans.
Yeah, I really think that is a telling detail of the story. So when Cutler started this work during World War II, he was doing it on prisoners in Indiana. But he always gave them full and informed consent about what he was doing. He said, look, we're going to be giving you an STD, but I will be treating you with it. And he explained what the goal of the research was. He was very, very clear about what he was doing, about the risks involved, and he was seeking out volunteers. But suddenly, he goes down to Guatemala, and all that gets thrown out the window. There's no consent forms. There's no information about what he's doing. He's suddenly doing the work in secret, running around and infecting people with these diseases without telling them. And that really does give away the whole game, that he basically had no respect for these people.
So moving on to the title of your book, which is always one of my favorite questions. The title of your book is The Icepick Surgeon. Who is the Icepick Surgeon, and what was he doing with it?
So the Icepick Surgeon, to me, is one of the more fascinating characters in the book, both for the work he did and just his big, outsized, colorful, and in many ways horrific personality. It was a doctor named Walter Freeman who became known as the Icepick lobotomist. And I explain a little bit more about this in the book, and this sounds kind of crazy for people nowadays to hear, but lobotomies, when they started, were defensible. They weren't as bad as we think of them nowadays. So going back to that time, maybe the 20s, the 30s, around that era, people basically had no treatments for psychiatric illnesses. There were 0 drugs available, 0 effective treatments. There was nothing you could do if someone had a serious mental disturbance. All they would do is they would basically tie them in a straitjacket, throw them in a room, and shove food in the door. And those people lived like that in their own filth year after year after year. There was nothing doctors could do to them. So when lobotomies came along, and leucotomies, which were the original version of them, when this came along, it actually offered some hope. In some cases, it could calm people down. And as a last resort procedure, when there was nothing else they could do, lobotomies did help people in some cases. So they were defensible in those circumstances. And this is where Walter Freeman enters the picture. Walter Freeman was a big enthusiast about lobotomies, and he wanted essentially to empty out asylums across the world. He thought asylums were terrible places. He wanted to get rid of them, and he really, really wanted to help all of these people. Unfortunately for him, Walter Freeman was very ambitious, and he was extremely impatient. And I think he had a bit of a messiah complex where he decided he was going to be the one to single-handedly save all of these people in mental institutions. And he got impatient with early lobotomies because they were essentially full-on neurological procedures. You had a neurosurgeon there. The person had to go under with anesthesia. You had to drill a hole in their skull. It was an invasive procedure that took a long time to do and a long time to recover from it. But Freeman said, we're not going to do that. I want to develop a quickie lobotomy, sort of an in and out procedure, a Jiffy Lube lobotomy. And he eventually developed a way to go in through the eye socket while the person was not under anesthesia. He would often knock them out with electrical shocks, but they were not under anesthesia. And he could finish the procedure in just 20 minutes and then send them home. And that just sounds crazy that we would have an outpatient neurosurgery like that, but that's what Walter Freeman wanted to do. And the title of the book comes in because the very first procedures that Walter Freeman did, he opened up his kitchen drawer one day, found an ice pick in there, and decided that this would be the perfect tool to use for his first lobotomies. So he used an ice pick that he just found in his kitchen drawer to perform neurosurgery. And that's where the title comes in.
Yeah, because he had many patients and he would keep up with them over the years. And then he kind of presented that as some sort of evidence that what he did was good work. But that in itself was not very good science because he didn't have a control group. So here again is an example of unethical science being bad science.
Yeah, so Freeman was a big enthusiast of these ice pick lobotomies, and every summer he would get in his car and drive around to asylums across the United States. Any small town that had an asylum, he would go there, he would line up a half a dozen, a full dozen, 24 patients sometimes, and give them all lobotomies. He would invite reporters around, he would have them taking pictures of him while he was doing the lobotomy. He had one trick where he would take basically an ice pick in each hand, and he would do 2 lobotomies at once because he was ambidextrous. He loved the attention, and he loved being a showman, and he knew that the more attention he got, the more high profile that lobotomies would be. And he started doing them on a lot of different people as well. He started doing them on children as young as 4 years old. He also assisted on one with Rosemary Kennedy, who was President John F. Kennedy's sister, and she ended up in an asylum the rest of her life. So he was willing to do a lobotomy for whomever, wherever, as long as he got permission from the asylum superintendent. And he ended up having thousands and thousands of cases over the years. He ended up doing something like 4,000 individuals all by himself. Ended up killing several of them on the table. Others of them ended up worse off than they were before. But Freeman always contended that he was doing good science because he would follow up with people. He would write up reports about them. But what he overlooked was the fact that he never had a control group when he was doing this scientific work. So he would give 25 people a lobotomy and then claim that they were all improved without comparing them to another group who had not gotten lobotomies and seeing how the two compared over a long-term study. And that's really problematic because a fair number of people who have psychiatric troubles end up getting, if not all the way better, their symptoms end up relieving themselves on their own. So without that control group, it's impossible to say whether the lobotomy group did actually improve because of the lobotomy, or did they improve in spite of the lobotomy? And in fact, would they have been better off without getting a lobotomy? Without that control group, it's basically impossible to tell. So this is a good example where the bad science, the poorly structured scientific experiment, ends up being unethical because he subjected a lot of people to this procedure and used them as evidence for doing even more of them without knowing whether it actually worked or not.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories is a guy from Philadelphia. His name is Harry Gold. So Harry Gold was kind of like a part-time chemist who lived in Philadelphia. But he was, at one point, in his possession, he had the blueprints for the atomic bomb that would eventually make it their way to the Soviet Union. Can you tell us how this guy from Philadelphia, who is kind of rotund and bald and like the kind of like the unlikeliest of people to end up with some of the most powerful information.
Yeah, Harry Gold really was a very unlikely person to end up at the center of an espionage ring. He was just kind of a normal, everyday chemist. He was kind of overweight and schlubby. He just did not look like the kind of person who'd be at the center of international scandal, something like that. But he was. He got recruited into espionage in a very sort of subtle way by a friend of his. The friend got him a job during the Depression, and Gold was very, very grateful for this. And the friend said, hey, can you help me just, get a few documents and things? The friend was a communist, and he wanted to send these documents about things like how to make better paint, how to make better lacquer, how to make better rubber. Wanted to send that to people in the Soviet Union to help them out, to help them industrialize. And Harry Gold said, okay, sure, fine, I'll steal these little trade secrets, send them on, and that'll be it. But he slowly got dragged in deeper and deeper and deeper. Pretty soon he wasn't just taking the documents. Pretty soon he was copying them out, writing up reports on them. Then pretty soon he was running the documents up to New York and actually making handoffs with Soviet agents up there. And while he started off doing just industrial espionage, eventually they moved him over to military espionage during World War II. And again, it was sort of scientific military espionage at first, things like explosives. But eventually, he proved to be such a good spy, in part because he was pretty unremarkable. No one noticed him. No one really cared about him, which is a good quality for a spy. And because he was so unremarkable, the Soviets ended up recruiting him to help spy on the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. I think most people are aware there were spies in Los Alamos who were stealing atomic secrets and handing them to the Soviet Union. But it was Harry Gold who would actually go down to New Mexico, take the documents, and get them to the people that were taking them to the Soviet Union. So he was really the key courier who was not only developing the people and getting information from them down in New Mexico, but also bringing them up to New York and other places and making the handoffs that got them to the Soviet Union. So he was a key node in this scientific spy ring when he just was, in some ways, just a regular, everyday chemist. And the thing I always thought was really fascinating about Harry Gold was that he hated spying. He did not like being a spy. He found it stressful. He found it tedious. He did not want to be involved. But he was so far in that he felt like he couldn't stop. But whenever he would make one of his handoffs or he needed to decompress a little bit from all the stress of spying, he would actually run into his chemistry lab and start doing experiments there. He liked the work. It calmed his mind down to be doing chemistry. And I think that's really fascinating that someone would use science in that way to kind of blow off steam from the stress of espionage.
Let's get some summation of the book. What do you hope people walk away from with this book?
Something that I really hope people walk away with from the book is that this kind of work, it shouldn't undermine the work that scientists do nowadays, because the vast majority of scientists are great, lovely people doing selfless things to try to make society better. But every once in a while, scientists do go rogue. They do dastardly things. And I really hope that people can read this book and find some warning signs, some sort of things that push people to go too far, and to think about those kind of things and to think about how to prevent them. And I think in general, we are better nowadays about understanding the ethics of science and understanding that there is an ethical dimension to science, because science is powerful. Science is so intimately involved in so many aspects of our lives that we do think about the ethics of science. Unfortunately, I think in some cases, it's more people talking about general ethical rules. It's sort of like, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not do this or shalt not do that. And that's good to keep those principles in mind, but when they're kind of abstract like that, they're a little harder to follow. And everyone says, well, of course I wouldn't do that, or I wouldn't do that. I think when the information is presented as a story, the way it is in the book, I think it's more powerful that way because you can see the conflicting motivations in people. You can see the moments where they went wrong. You can see the moments where if someone had stepped in and stopped them, things might have gone the other direction, or people might have been spared a lot of heartache and in some cases a lot of death. So I think the story form, when you really are there with the victims, you're in their mind and you feel that gut punch the way they did, I think that's a more effective way to get this across and to really make the morality and the ethics stick as opposed to these general rules.
Yeah, I think for me, the takeaway was that unethical science leads to bad science, which is not something that I think about all that much, but that definitely did stuck with me.
I think it can actually go both ways. I think that unethical science is often bad science, and bad science is often unethical science. I think those two things are very intimately linked.
Yeah. Well, Sam, thanks so much for talking to me. I know that there were so many stories that we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about this Harvard psychological study that had the Unabomber involved. We didn't talk about this really horrible idea that there's a blank slate theory of human nature. And there's so many stories we didn't talk about they can find in your book. If you just want to give a plug to your work and how they can find it.
Yeah, so this book, The Icepick Surgeon, is essentially about scientists who took things way, way too far and got so obsessed with some topic or idea that they trampled ethical boundaries and often committed crimes in the name of science. So you'll see pirates in there. You'll see spies in there, people who committed murder and fraud and sabotage, some really dark, dastardly deeds, all done in the name of science and in the pursuit of knowledge. And we usually think about the pursuit of knowledge as a good thing. But in these cases, it got twisted into a dark thing, and people ended up being harmed for it.
Great. Well, Sam, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Distillations.
Remember, Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine.
You can find our videos, stories, and every single podcast episode at distillations.org. And you'll also find podcast transcripts and show notes.
You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center.
This episode was produced by Mariel Carr and Rigo Hernandez.
And it was mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer.
The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give-now.
For Distillations, I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago.
Thanks for listening.